The archives of Blackwood Manor, bound in worn leather and smelling faintly of wood smoke and thyme, do not speak of grand battles or political treaties. Instead, they tell a quieter story, pieced together from household ledgers, private correspondences, and the marginalia of a duchess's personal diary. It is a story of a winter of the heart and the slow, unexpected thaw that followed. It begins, as so many tragedies do, with a lie whispered in the gilded cage of London society. I was Alara Vance, a name as plain and serviceable as the brown wool dresses I was expected to favor. My existence was a quiet one, lived in the echoing hallways of my late parents' townhouse, a property now under the stewardship of my fiancé, Viscount Harding, and his formidable mother. They had moved in with the ink still wet on the betrothal contract, their presence a constant, heavy pressure, like the damp London air that seeped through the window frames. I was a creature of shadow and silence, my only perceived value contained within the considerable dowry that would soon pass from my solicitor's hands into theirs. The Viscount, Robert, was a man sculpted from polished mediocrity. He possessed a passable face, a title of little consequence, and a bottomless well of vanity. He regarded me with the same dispassionate eye one might cast upon a broodmare, a necessary acquisition for the continuation of his line and, more pressingly, the salvation of his finances. His conversation was a desert of horse racing, club gossip, and complaints about his tailor, and I often found myself drifting away during his monologues, my mind retreating to the sanctuary of the books he deemed a waste of a woman's time. His mother, the Dowager Viscountess Harding, was the true architect of my gilded prison. She was a woman of iron will and glacial smiles, her spine as rigid as her social principles. She moved through my home as if it were already hers, her sharp eyes cataloging every piece of silver, every painting, every inch of silk drapery. To her, I was not a daughter-to-be, but a line item on a ledger, a simple, unadorned key to a treasure chest she felt was her due. She corrected my posture, criticized my needlework, and tutted at my preference for reading over the vapid chatter of morning calls. I was a project to be managed, a flaw to be polished away until nothing of the original remained. Their life was a performance of wealth they could not sustain. The claret flowed a little too freely. The new carriage was a shade too ostentatious, and the promissory notes to a dozen London merchants were piling up like autumn leaves. My dowry was not just a convenience. It was a lifeline they were grasping with desperate hands, and I was the unfortunate soul tied to the other end of the rope. I endured it all with a quiet dignity that they mistook for weakness. I was the still, deep water they saw as a placid pond, never suspecting the currents that ran beneath. The impending event that hung over the season was the annual Blackwood Ball. It was the undisputed pinnacle of the social calendar, hosted by a man who was more myth than peer, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He was a phantom, a creature of rumor and speculation. The gossips whispered that he was impossibly wealthy, impossibly severe, and still locked in a winter of grief for a wife who had died years ago. He rarely appeared in society, and when he did, he was a forbidding presence, his dark eyes missing nothing, his words few and clipped. An invitation to his ball was a command, a sign that one had not yet fallen from the precarious ladder of the ton. For the Hardings, the invitation was a vindication, a confirmation of the status they so craved. For me, it was merely another evening to be endured, another performance of a role I had never auditioned for. Lady Harding insisted on a new gown for me, a confection of ivory silk that was meant to signal maidenly purity, but felt more like a sacrificial shroud. It was beautiful, I supposed, but it was not me. The real me was hidden beneath the layers of silk and expectation, a silent observer in my own life. The night of the ball arrived on a wave of cold mist. Blackwood Manor was a fortress of granite and glass, blazing with the light of 1,000 candles against the encroaching dark. Its grand facade was intimidating, a declaration of power and permanence that made the Hardings' borrowed finery seem tawdry by comparison. Inside, the air hummed with the sound of a string quartet, the murmur of hundreds of voices, and the rustle of silk. Chandeliers, like frozen waterfalls of crystal, hung from the frescoed ceilings, their light glinting off jewels and polished floors. As expected, I was a ghost at the feast. Robert, my fiancé, dutifully danced the opening waltz with me, his touch impersonal, his eyes already scanning the room for more important company. Once his duty was done, he abandoned me near a potted fern, murmuring a vague promise to return with lemonade that we both knew was a lie. Lady Harding across the room was holding court, her sharp laughter like the chipping of ice. I was alone in a crowd of hundreds, an island of quiet in a sea of noise. It was a familiar feeling, this invisibility. I had worn it for so long it felt like a second skin. The air grew thick and cloying with the scent of perfume and wilting flowers. I needed to escape. Slipping through a curtained archway, I found myself on a small, secluded terrace, blessedly cool and quiet. The damp night air was a balm on my warm skin. Below, the formal gardens lay sleeping under a sliver of moon, a maze of dark hedges and pale, ghostly statuary. For a moment, I could breathe. For a moment, I was not the Viscount's fiancé or Lady Harding's project. I was just Alara. Then I heard their voices. They came from just inside the ballroom, near the open French doors to the terrace where I stood, cloaked in shadow. It was Robert and his mother. Their words, sharp and clear in the sudden quiet, drifted out to me like shards of glass. "She is a trial, Robert," Lady Harding said, her voice stripped of its public charm and honed to a cruel edge. "So dreadfully plain. That gown is entirely wasted on her. She has all the animation of a garden snail." "A necessary burden, mother," Robert replied, and his voice held a note of dismissive boredom that cut me deeper than any overt cruelty could have. "Once her dowry is secured, she can read her dusty books and grow old in the country. I have no use for a plain little mouse in London." A woman's light laugh, not his mother's, joined his. "Isabel understands. She knows the arrangement is purely for financial convenience." The name, Isabelle de Courcy, a dazzling, newly widowed baroness, landed like a physical blow. The serpent of jealousy, an emotion I had never thought to feel for Robert, was secondary to the wave of pure, unadulterated humiliation that washed over me. A plain little mouse. A necessary burden. My entire worth, my entire future, reduced to a business transaction he was already planning to betray. I did not cry. The tears froze in my throat, turning into a column of ice that ran straight down my spine. A strange, terrible clarity descended upon me. The gilded cage had never been a home. It had been a holding pen, and I, the livestock. The quiet dignity I had cultivated was not strength to them, but proof of my meekness, my stupidity. They had misjudged me completely. Slowly, I stepped out from the shadows of the terrace and back into the light of the doorway. They fell silent, their faces a mask of shock. Lady Harding's mouth was a thin, hard line. Robert had the decency to flush, a faint stain of red on his pale cheeks. My hands were perfectly steady as I pulled the Harding betrothal ring from my finger. It was a heavy, ostentatious sapphire, chosen by his mother, of course. It felt cold and foreign against my skin. I held it out to him, my palm flat. "I believe this is yours, my lord," I said. My voice did not tremble. It was a quiet sound, yet it seemed to fill the sudden, tense silence between us. I would not wish to be a burden a moment longer. I did not wait for a response. I placed the ring into his stunned, unmoving hand, turned my back on him and his mother, and walked away. I did not run. I walked, my head held high, my spine as straight as Lady Harding's own. Each step was a declaration of independence. I could feel the eyes of the room turning towards me, drawn by the silent, radiating drama of the moment. I focused on the grand staircase, my only thought to escape, to get away, to breathe air that was not poisoned by their lies. But the icy calm that had sustained me began to fracture. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The brilliant light of the chandeliers splintered into 1,000 painful shards. My breath hitched. A wave of dizziness, born of shock and a day of uneaten meals, washed over me. I stumbled, my hand flying out to grasp a marble column for support. A hand, hard and bruising, seized my upper arm. "What do you think you are doing?" Robert hissed, his face contorted with fury and public embarrassment. "You will not make a scene and ruin me." The room had fallen into a hush. All eyes were on us. I saw pity on some faces, malicious glee on others. I felt trapped, a specimen pinned to a board for all to see. Then, a new presence made itself felt. It was not a sound, but a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden drop in temperature. A path cleared through the crowd, as if by an invisible force. From the shadows of the upper gallery, a figure descended the grand staircase. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace, a man utterly at home in his power. It was the Duke of Blackwood. Alistair Beaumont was darker and more formidable in person than the rumors suggested. He was tall, dressed in immaculate black that made him seem like a figure carved from night and winter frost. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, a face that looked as if it had never known a smile. But his eyes were the most startling part. They were a pale, piercing gray, and they were fixed not on the gawking crowd, but on Robert's hand on my arm. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, the words were quiet, yet they cut through the silence of the vast ballroom like the crack of a whip. "Unhand her." It was not a request. It was a command, absolute and final. Robert, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He snatched his hand back from my arm, as if he had been burned. The Duke's glacial gaze swept over the Viscount, a look of such profound, dismissive contempt that Robert physically shrank back. Without a word, the Duke of Blackwood was before me. He did not touch me, but I felt the heat of his presence, a stark contrast to his icy reputation. He simply offered me his arm, the black wool of his coat a stark, solid reality in my swimming vision. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice now a low, resonant baritone meant only for me. "Allow me." Numbly, I placed my trembling hand on his arm. It was like touching granite, warm from the sun. He turned, and with me on his arm, he began to walk towards the main entrance, the entire ballroom parting before him like the Red Sea. He did not look back. Neither did I. He was escorting me out of my public execution, out of my old life, and into a future I could not possibly have imagined. The great oak doors of Blackwood Manor closed behind us, shutting out the whispers and the stares, and for the first time that night, I felt a flicker not of escape, but of safety. He did not take me home. My carriage was summoned, but the directions he gave the driver were not to the Harding residence that had become my prison. We rode in a magnificent, blessed silence, the carriage swaying gently over the cobblestones. The interior was dark, smelling of rich leather and the faint, clean scent of winter air that seemed to cling to the Duke himself. I sat opposite him, my hands clenched in the folds of my ivory silk gown, my mind a maelstrom of shock and a strange, budding gratitude. He did not pry or offer platitudes. He simply watched me, his pale eyes shadowed by the passing gaslights. He seemed to understand that words were useless things at that moment. His silence was a gift, a space for me to gather the shattered pieces of myself. We stopped not at a townhouse, but before the imposing gates of his own London residence, a place even more formidable than the manor where the ball had been held. "You will be safe here, Miss Vance," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My housekeeper will see to your needs. No one will trouble you." He led me not into a formal receiving room, but into the heart of the house, his library. It was a cathedral of books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves soared into the shadows, packed with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire crackling on the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the room. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and burning oak. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. It was a sanctuary. "Please," he said, gesturing to a deep burgundy velvet armchair near the fire. He moved to a decanter on a nearby table and poured a small measure of amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Brandy, for the shock." He placed it on a small table beside my chair before I could refuse. I sank into the chair, the velvet soft and enveloping. The warmth from the fire began to seep into my chilled bones, a slow, welcome invasion. A servant, a woman with a kind, weathered face and a starched white cap, appeared as if from nowhere. She was Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, her presence as solid and reassuring as the house itself. She took my wrap and, on a quiet word from the Duke, returned minutes later with a heavy cashmere shawl, which she draped gently over my shoulders, and a cup of steaming tea laced with honey. These were acts of quiet care, practical and observant. There were no effusive apologies for my distress, no demands for explanation. He simply saw my need, for warmth, for quiet, for fortification, and met it. He took a seat in the chair opposite me, the firelight carving his severe features into a mask of light and shadow. We sat in a comfortable quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle ticking of a tall case clock in the corner. After a long time, he finally spoke, his voice low. "I am aware of Viscount Harding's financial position, Miss Vance. I have been, for some time." I looked up, surprised. "You have?" "I make it my business to know the dealings of men who move in my circles," he said simply. "Especially those who prey on the vulnerable." There was a dangerous edge to his voice now, a controlled ruthlessness that sent a shiver through me, though it was not directed at me. "What you did tonight, walking away from him, it required a courage few possess." His praise was delivered as a statement of fact, not a compliment, which made it all the more potent. He saw courage where others, where I, had only seen desperation. "I saw something of myself in you tonight," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Or rather, what I should have been." He paused, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than severity crossed his face. It was a deep, profound sadness. My late wife, the Duchess, she was what society calls a diamond. Beautiful, celebrated, desired. Our marriage was an arrangement, much like your own was meant to be. I provided a title and security, She provided an air and beauty. He fell silent, and I held my breath, knowing I was being granted a glimpse into the fortress of his solitude. She was hollow, he said, the word dropping into the quiet room with immense weight. A perfect, shimmering bauble with nothing inside. She adored the society that I despise. When she died, I did not feel grief. I felt nothing. An emptiness where love should have been, and I was ashamed of that nothingness. This was the secret of the Iron Duke, not a heart broken by grief, but a heart that had never been engaged at all. He had been as trapped in his gilded cage as I had been in mine. I retreated, he said, his gaze finally meeting mine across the flickering space between us. His pale eyes were unguarded for the first time, revealing a startling vulnerability. I have lived in a winter of my own making, Miss Vance, a self-imposed exile from a world I find vacuous and cruel. Tonight, in that ballroom, I saw that same world attempt to crush someone of substance, of quiet strength. I saw it send a blizzard your way, and you did not bow to it. You stood and faced the wind. A strange connection, fragile yet profound, bloomed in the warmth of the library. He was not just a powerful duke. He was a man who understood the nature of my prison because he had built his own. In his confession, I found an odd sort of comfort. I was not alone in my isolation. I stayed at Blackwood House for 3 days, a guest in a state of suspended reality. Mrs. Davies was a discreet and formidable chaperone, her presence silencing any potential for gossip. She declared to the few necessary callers that I was recovering from a nervous swoon brought on by the crush at the ball, a plausible fiction that society would grudgingly accept. For those 3 days, I lived in a bubble of peace. I spent my hours in the library, the scent of old books a soothing balm to my frayed spirit. I read poetry and history, my mind starved for so long, feasting on the words. The Duke, Alistair, left me mostly to my own devices, yet his presence was a constant protective shield around the house. We took our meals together, often in the quiet of the library. Our conversations were not of the ton or my predicament, but of books, of philosophy, of the neglected gardens visible from the windows. I found him to possess a sharp, incisive mind and a wicked, dry wit that he reserved for skewering the very society he avoided. In these quiet moments, I began to see the man behind the fearsome ducal mask, and I found myself liking him very much. I felt my own mind, long dormant, beginning to awaken, my opinions valued, my thoughts met with respect. This, I realized, was a more intoxicating feeling than any courtship I could have imagined. On the 4th morning, the peace was shattered. A commotion erupted in the entrance hall, loud, angry voices echoing up the main staircase. I stood from my place by the library window, my heart beginning to hammer in my chest. I recognized that voice. It was Robert. I moved to the library door and opened it a crack. Viscount Harding stood in the center of the black and white marble floor, his face florid with rage and wine. Lady Harding stood beside him, her face a mask of cold fury. Several footmen stood between them and the staircase, looking to Mrs. Davies for instruction. "I am her fiancé," Robert bellowed, brandishing a piece of paper. "This is a physician's note attesting to her delicate mental state. She is overwrought, unwell. You are holding her against her will. I demand to see her." It was his final, desperate gambit. Without my dowry, his creditors, who had been held at bay by the promise of our imminent marriage, were now circling like vultures. He meant to reclaim me by force, to declare me mentally incompetent and seize control of my fortune through a forced marriage. The thought was so vile, it made me physically ill. Before Mrs. Davies could respond, a calm, cold voice came from the top of the stairs. Your concern for Miss Vance's health is touching, Harding, if entirely misplaced. Alistair descended the stairs, not with the dramatic flair of his entrance at the ball, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying. He did not look at Robert, but at the paper in his hand. A physician's note? From Dr. Mills, I presume, the man to whom you owe a rather substantial gambling debt? He let that hang in the air for a moment. An interesting choice. He reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped, his sheer presence reducing the Viscount to a sputtering, red-faced buffoon. I have been rather busy these past 3 days, my lord, the Duke said, his voice deceptively pleasant. While Miss Vance has been enjoying the peace of my library, I have been enjoying a new hobby. I have taken up collecting. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. His solicitor, a thin, spectacled man I had not noticed standing near the door, stepped forward and opened a large leather portfolio. You see, Alistair continued, his eyes finally locking onto Robert's, I have been collecting debt markers, mortgages, promissory notes, all the little slips of paper that represent the web of lies you and your mother have spun across London. He took a sheaf of papers from the solicitor. I own your house. I own the note on your new carriage. I own the debt to your tailor, your wine merchant, and, as of 9 o'clock this morning, I own the entire debt of your family's country estate, which has been mortgaged to the hilt for 2 generations. He fanned the papers out like a hand of cards. You are ruined, my lord, utterly and completely. Every creditor you have now answers to me. The next roof over your head will be one of my choosing. Do you understand? Lady Harding let out a small, strangled gasp. Robert's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. The bravado drained out of him, leaving behind the weak, pathetic man he had always been. The Duke's cold gaze swept over them both, a look of ultimate, final dismissal. Then, he turned his back on their ruin and faced me, as I stood half-hidden in the library doorway. The harsh, ruthless mask fell away, replaced by an expression of profound, weary regret. This is not how I intended this, he said, his voice low and raw. To use my power as a cudgel. It is the very thing I despise. He took a step towards me, his pale eyes pleading. But the thought of him laying a hand on you, of his voice even reaching you, I could not bear it. He stopped before me, so close I could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair. Ilara, he said, using my given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. I know the timing is abominable. I know what this must look like. But I find I cannot bear the thought of you leaving this house, of you leaving me. He took a deep breath, the confession torn from the very depths of his guarded soul. Marry me, Ilara. Be my duchess, not as a rescue, not as an arrangement, but as a partner, as my equal, as the woman who stood against the wind and reminded me that my own winter did not have to be eternal. It was the most beautiful proposal ever uttered, not of flowery poetry, but of stark, stunning honesty. It was an offering not of a title, but of a shared life, a partnership. In his eyes, I saw my own worth reflected back at me, brighter and stronger than I had ever dared to believe. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a library that had become my haven, I knew my answer. My quiet life was over. A new one was about to begin. The Duke was a man of strategy, and he understood that a private victory was no victory at all in the eyes of the world. Our enemies had to be defeated on their own battlefield, the merciless stage of London society. He arranged for a grand musicale to be held at Blackwood House 1 week later. The invitations were sent, and with morbid curiosity, the whole of the ton accepted. The most coveted invitation, a cruel and brilliant twist of the knife, was sent to Viscount Harding and his mother. To refuse would be to publicly admit defeat. They attended, their faces pale and taut, a desperate, final attempt to bluff their way through their own ruin. I stood beside Alistair as we received our guests. I wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, a color of life and resilience. The Duke had commissioned it for me, its richness and simple, elegant lines, a reflection of how he saw me. I was no longer a plain mouse in sacrificial ivory. I was a woman coming into her own power. As I greeted the lords and ladies, my voice was steady, my smile genuine. With Alistair at my side, a silent, formidable wall of support, I felt not fear, but a thrilling sense of anticipation. The musicale was a triumph. The singer was Italian, her voice a soaring wonder that filled the grand salon. During a lull between performances, as servants moved through the room with trays of champagne, Alistair led me to the center of the floor. A hush fell over the assembled guests. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying with ease to every corner of the room. "Thank you for joining us this evening. I have asked for your attention for a moment to share with you some news of profound personal happiness." He turned to me, and the look in his eyes was so full of warmth and affection that it silenced any doubt in the room. He took my hand. "I have the distinct honor of announcing my engagement to Miss Ilara Vance." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a masterstroke. By announcing our engagement, he was not only claiming me as his own, but retroactively legitimizing my presence in his house, transforming scandalous rumor into a romantic, albeit whirlwind, courtship. He was rewriting the narrative, placing me under the unassailable protection of his name. "I object!" the shout came from the corner of the room. Viscount Harding, his face flushed with champagne and desperation, pushed his way forward. "This is a travesty. She is my betrothed. This man has used his power and influence to poison her mind against me. She is an opportunist, a faithless creature who—" Alistair did not even deign to look at him. He held up a hand, and the Viscount's tirade faltered. "My lord," Alistair said, his tone one of weary patience, "you have no claim on Miss Vance. Your engagement was terminated. Publicly, I believe." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd, many of whom had witnessed the scene at the ball. "As for my influence," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft level, "I have indeed been busy. Mr. Timmins?" His solicitor, who had been standing discreetly by the door, once again stepped forward with his leather portfolio. He did not need to open it this time. The sight of it was enough. "Lord Harding's financial affairs are now my own," Alistair announced calmly. "As of tomorrow, the Harding estates, townhouse, and all associated assets will be liquidated to settle his considerable debts. He and his mother will be relocating." He said the word as if describing the transport of unsavory cargo. The ruin was now public, absolute, and undeniable. Lady Harding looked as if she might faint, her iron spine finally beginning to bend. Then, Alistair looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He had dismantled my enemies, but he was giving the final, killing blow to me. It was my right, my vindication. I stepped forward, my gaze finding Robert's. The entire room was silent, waiting. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "My lord," I said, my voice as clear and cool as a winter morning, "you once referred to me as a necessary burden. I assure you, I have simply decided to become an unnecessary one. You are free of me now." I paused, letting the words sink in. A final, perfect twist of the silken blade he had unknowingly given me. "And I, blessedly, am free of you." It was over. There was no applause, only a stunned, profound silence. I had not screamed or wept. I had met his blustering rage with quiet, articulate finality. I had claimed my own story. Turning my back on his gaping, defeated face, I took Alistair's offered arm, and together we walked out of the salon, leaving the wreckage of the Harding dynasty behind for society to pick over like crows on a battlefield. We did not stay in London. The city and its venomous whispers had no place in the life we were building. We retreated to Blackwood Manor, the great country estate that had once been the seat of his wintry isolation, but now, returning with me, it felt different. The sun, low in the autumn sky, seemed to catch the granite walls and warm them. The air was crisp and clean. That evening, standing before the same roaring fire in the library where he had first confessed his solitude to me, Alistair turned me to face him. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. His pale, severe eyes, which had held so much sorrow, were now filled with a light I had only dreamed of seeing. "Alara," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "My Duchess. My partner." And then he kissed me. It was not a chaste, polite kiss of betrothal. It was a kiss of breathtaking passion and profound relief. A sealing of the bond that had been forged in fire and humiliation. It was the kiss of a man coming home, of a heart thawing after a long, lonely winter. It was the start of everything. We were married a week later in the estate's small, sun-drenched chapel, with only Mrs. Davies and a few loyal servants as witnesses. There was no grand spectacle, no fawning crowd. There was only us, and the quiet, sacred promises we made to each other. The months that followed were a quiet symphony of healing. I discovered that the Duchess of Blackwood was not a role to be performed, but a title I could define for myself. While Alistair managed the vast concerns of his dukedom, I turned my attention to the manor's gardens. They had been neglected for years, a sprawling, beautiful mess of overgrown roses and tangled ivy, a perfect metaphor for the estate's master. With the help of the elderly head gardener, I began the slow work of restoration. I learned the names of flowers, the cycles of the seasons. I found a deep, satisfying purpose in clearing the weeds, in pruning the dead wood to make way for new growth. My hands, once soft and pale from a life of useless inactivity, became smudged with dirt and calloused from effort. And I had never been happier. Alistair would often find me there in the afternoons, leaving his ledgers and reports to walk with me among the flower beds. He had changed. The harsh lines of his face had softened. He smiled now, a real, warm smile that was reserved only for me. The formidable Iron Duke, feared and respected throughout England, would listen with rapt attention as I explained my plans for a new herbaceous border, his hand always finding mine, his presence a constant, comforting warmth at my side. He was no longer a phantom in his own home. He was its heart, and he had given that heart into my keeping. One crisp spring morning, almost a year after the infamous musicale, a letter arrived with the London post. It was from Alistair's solicitor. I read it as we took our breakfast in a small sunroom overlooking the gardens, which were now bursting with the vibrant colors of tulips and daffodils. The letter confirmed that the last of the Harding assets had been sold. Robert and his mother were living in a damp, rented cottage in a remote part of Wales, their names erased from London society as surely as if they had never existed. My former maid, Mary, who had shown me small kindnesses in that oppressive house, and whom I had since hired as my personal attendant, had heard through her own network of servants that Lady Harding's health had broken under the strain of their downfall, and Robert had taken to drink. I felt no glee, no triumph, only a distant, quiet pity for two people so consumed by vanity and greed that they had destroyed themselves. I folded the letter and placed it to one side. Their story was over. Mine was just beginning. Alistair watched me, his expression knowing. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," I replied, my voice firm. I looked out at the garden, at the riot of life I had nurtured from the neglected earth. They chose their path, and I have found mine. He reached across the table and took my hand, his long fingers lacing through mine. His pale gray eyes, once the color of winter storms, were now the color of a soft spring sky after the rain. He had found his purpose, not in power or wealth, but in our shared sanctuary. In me, he had found his summer, and in him, I had found my home. The archives of Blackwood Manor are right. It is not a story of politics or power, but of how two solitary souls, two quiet hearts, found each other in the wreckage of a broken promise and built a new world from the ruins, a world as vibrant and full of life as a garden in full bloom.